Hey there, welcome back to part 6 of rebuilding Linea's website. The first time I need more than one hand to show you the number of parts we have already made. In this series we are rebuilding Linea's homepage and every amazing detail it brings. In the previous 5 parts we built things like the homepage hero component, the keyboard shortcut component that shows all of the keyboard shortcuts you can use in Linear. And last week we also built a command menu component, which resembles the command menu used in Linear for quick actions. If you did not see any of the previous videos, absolutely click the link above, because that goes directly to the playlist where you can watch all of the different parts so far. In this part of the series, we are going to focus on rebuilding this component where Linear shows all of the different features and functionalities their app has. And actually this component is used multiple times on the page, because if we scroll down you see that there's actually multiple versions that are quite similar. They have different content, there's a different color, but apart from that they are the same. So we're going to build a component that is reusable and where you can change this color very easily without a lot of custom CSS. And if we look at the page, there's 3 blocks and perhaps even 4, because I think we can make this one with the same component as well. So there's 4 blocks on this page before the end of the page. So that means that after we've built this component, we're probably like 90% along the way to finish this page. So let's not wait any longer and start building this component. So I suggest that we're going to name this component features, which means that we're going to create a new file called features.tsx. In here, we're going to create a new component called features. And that component will, of course, get a few props. For now, I'm going to add the title in here. But besides the title, I don't think I'm going to add anything else yet. And the reason for it is because I want to make this component in such a way that you can create all of the different variations of this component. Because if we scroll down, you see that there's cards here, which I think could be part of this features component. But if we scroll further down, you see that the next one doesn't have any cards. And if we scroll even further, you see that this linear workflows block also does not have any cards. So we could, of course, add everything as props to this features component and then make sure that the cards are optional. That could definitely work. However, it could be the case that next week the designer comes in and also asks you to be able to toggle this grid and not always show that. And if that's also the case, then you start making all the different props optional. And by making all of them optional, it becomes a lot more confusing what the component can show and what it can't show. So for that, there is actually a different solution called compound components, and that's a principle that I want to apply to this component today to really show you the power of compound components, because that way you can create a component that has a lot of different variations without making a lot of different props. And that is the reason that for now I'm only gonna add a title to this features component. That means that for now we're gonna render this title. And we're probably gonna return a section in which we add the h2 with this title. And what I then want to do is add a new section to our sections components, which we're gonna show on the homepage in a minute. And I'm gonna create a section for every block of features. But first start with one so we can build the first one out. That section I'm gonna name Enjoy Issue Tracking. And that section is then gonna render our new feature block, where the title becomes Issue Tracking You'll Enjoy Using. So going back to our own rebuild, we still don't see anything, and that's because we also need to render this section on our homepage. And after we've done that, we have a very boring title. Hooray. But first, let's add a little bit more of the structure before we start making things look nice. I think there's 4 different types of blocks in this feature component. The first one is this main component, which is the main feature, I guess. And then the next one is the grid, which are these 6 blocks. And then we have a card, I guess. So that's the features cards, which are always with 2, at least for now. And that's actually it. So not 4, but 3 different components. And compound components enables you to render them as children. And that brings you the very big benefit of being able to reorder them, skip items, so that everything becomes a lot more dynamic without the need to have a lot of different prop combinations. So the way that works is, let's first create a few components that will later render these 3 different variants. The first one I'm gonna call main. Let's call it main feature to be even more clear. And that returns for now a div where the big image will be put in. The second one is the feature grid. And the third one will be the feature cards. And now we have these 3 components. We could decide to export them. However, compound components most of the times also brings a certain naming convention. And that naming convention is really meant to show that these child components should only be used within a certain parent. Perhaps because that parent provides React context or does something with styling that the children need. And in this case, our subcomponents are really meant to be put inside our main parent because it also has the title and it puts a wrapper around it. So in order to show this parent-child relationship, what's actually common in a compound component pattern is to put the children underneath the parent component. And that looks as following. We can add a property to our features object called main and set that to the value main feature. And we can do the same for the grid and also for the cards. And now we have this. There's one more thing we need to add to our features component, and that is the option to render children, because right now it only renders the title, and if we would put children in here, we wouldn't see them. So let's first add children and also render them. And now if we go back to our component, we can simply start adding these features, and you already see that Copilot is kind of guessing what we want to do. We can render these components. And if we then go back to our own website, we see that all of the components are being rendered. And this dot notation doesn't do anything special except showing that there is some sort of parent-child relationship going on here. So if someone would use this features.main component somewhere random in the app, it should be a hint that that should not be allowed. And of course, depending on how you want to build your site, it could be the case that this cards component is actually a reusable thing and isn't part of this features component at all. In that case, it's absolutely fine to also make this a normal component and just render cards inside here. So now we have these components set up. Let's also make sure that we add the right props to them. So let's start with the main feature. That will accept an image, which will be the URL, that's a string, and it will accept some text. Now, there's again 2 options for this. You could either decide to make this a string, but what will happen if the client later on also asks you to add an icon in this text? So there's kind of a trade-off here. You could either decide to go with a string because that way you cannot mess up the layout because you can only put a string in here, or you can decide to use this as children and style that, because this way later on it will be a bit more dynamic. Right now I am gonna opt to use this as a string instead of children. And the reason for that is because if you look at Linea's website, the design is really important. So I really want to prevent people to mess up the layout of this component. So that way, if we prevent them from adding anything else than text, hopefully the layout stays intact. So let's add this text here as well, which is also a string. And that's it currently for the main feature component. So let's destructure them here as well. And that's it for this main component. If we then continue to the grid, we see that that's mainly a grid of texts. It has an icon, it has some sort of highlighted text, and it has the main body text. Then there's again multiple ways you can do this. We can either create a new component called feature grid item and also put that component on the features component, because doing that again makes it a lot more dynamic what you want to render in a grid. But again, that freedom also comes with a bit of responsibility. So I already decided to give the user the flexibility to decide which blocks within a feature they want to render, the main feature, the grid, or the cards. But I do not want to give the user of this component too much freedom in being able to render perhaps something else within a grid. So I'm going to opt with adding an array as a prop to this features grid component to really restrict the usage of this. And even if another developer later on wants to build something custom within this features grid, they can also decide to render a custom component inside this features component and decide not to use a grid component. So that means that we're going to add the type to our feature grid, and that accepts indeed some features. The feature has an icon, which will be a React component in a second. Then it has a title and the text, and that will be an array. So this way we can render all of the features in the grid. And lastly, we also have the feature cards. These feature cards I'm going to set up in exactly the same way as the features grid for the same reasons. So let's add a type here as well, where in this case it accepts an image, that's a string, it has a title, and it has some text. All right, and now we have set up all different props interfaces for our components. Let's also add the content to the section itself. So this main component has the text, as well as the image, which I'm gonna copy. So that image I copied and added inside the public directory, so we can link to that. So that means that we have the image which lives at issues.webp. Next is the grid component, for which I need to copy all of the icons. So let's do that as well. Okay, so those I've added inside the icons, and then I created a new directory called features. So that means that we can add a features array to our grid now. And in there, I'm gonna add again all of the content. Okay, and now I've added in all of the content, I actually see that I made a little TypeScript error. Because if we go back to our features, I defined it as a React element, which would mean that we need to do something like this. So it's already an element. That could work if that's what you desire, but it somehow feels a bit more ugly. So I'm gonna actually change this to react.functional component. So that way the error is also solved. And it works because this is kind of a constructor of a React element or a function that eventually will return one, but that still needs to be invoked, and that's the difference between those two types. And now we've added the content for that block in, we also still need to add the content for the last block, and then we finally get to styling this thing, so please bear with me one more time. Okay, so again, I added in the images as well as all of the text, and that brings us to a complete section with all of the content. So now if we switch back to our own website, we still don't see a lot, and that is because we don't render the content. So let's start doing that, and let's start adding some styles. This title looks exactly the same as the title we've used in our hero. So if we go to our own website, it's exactly the same as this title. So that means that we can just copy these classes. Let's add a class name, And then we add the text gradient to also have the gradient effect on this text, as well as the text 6 extra large and the text 8 extra large from medium and up. That already gives us a bigger text. Next is also making sure that we add proper spacing from the top of the page. The other thing that's important is also adding the right margin. And as I've explained before, most of the times you don't want to give your components a margin because that prevents you from using them in other places where the margin is different. So in this case, I'd suggest adding a wrapper in the homepage and in there setting the correct margin of this component. However, there's also some padding that is actually used in this component, which is part of the component itself. And that padding is 128 pixels. And since that's a custom value, we're going to use the arbitrary values for that again. So that means that we have a padding Y of 12.8 rem. And then this margin again is a bit harder to get because there's some negative margins applied as well. So the content flows underneath the previous component. So I'm actually going to use my screenshot tool on Mac to get the right size, which seems to be approximately 250 pixels. So if we divide that by 4, that means that the closest is 252 pixels. So let's go to our page and add a wrapper div around this component and add a class name with a margin Y of 25.2 rem. So this way there's already some spacing in the component. And the gap now looks quite large, but that's mainly because in a second we'll also be adding this gradient as well. And actually, instead of a div, we can use the container component, so that way also our content becomes centered again. And if we now look at our title, we see that the title is way too wide. And the reason again is because the linear team decided to add a line break in this H1 as well. So we could decide to make our title smaller so it breaks at the right point, but it's really finicky to have it break at exactly the right spot you want. So I'm actually thinking right now to remove this prop and also make this a compound component. So that way we can inject HTML and we can break it at the right place. So let's do that by taking this component out and creating a const features title, where the title now becomes a child. So this way we can use HTML in there. Let's quickly add the interface as well. And also make sure to add it to our features down here. And then we can remove our title prop from the wrapper component and then add in this title as a child. So this will give us the exact same result, but now we can also add the line break at the right place. And if we then start adding a bit more CSS, we have the exact same result. So that means that this section actually is a flex and has item center to align everything in the center. And then it should be a flex column instead of flex row, which is default. And you see I struggle in typing and talking at the same time. And then for this text, we can make the text in the center as well. And then I'm also going to add the main feature before we finish off this title, so we can add the exact spacing and things like that. So that component starts with the image, but this image is a transparent image. So the gradient in the background is actually part of the background and not of the image itself. So that means that we need to add another wrapper div in here as well. And that div will contain the image, which I'll replace with the next image component in a second. And then we also need to get some sort of max width from the image. And they seem to add some sort of inline styling for that. So probably they calculate something with JavaScript to make sure that it's positioned in exactly the same place. And since I don't know what the logic behind that is, I'm not gonna use that for now. So instead, I'm gonna take the width of 780 pixels or 78 rem and also give this a max width of 90%. And then we're gonna add width full and height auto on the image itself. So this way the image sizes up to the max of 780 pixels and scales down on mobile devices. And instead of adding it to this component, I'm actually going to copy it to the wrapper itself. So if we add the text in here in a second, that's also contained in this max width. And I say in a second, but let's again do that first. So let's get the right size of this text. It's 32 pixels in font size. So that maps to our 4XL font size. So let's add a paragraph around here and then give it a text 4XL and a color of white. And it should actually be text white, not color white. The text also has a margin top of 64 pixels. And if we look at our Tailwind config, for now we only have 56 as its largest. So let's still add 2 more. Because this way we can give it a margin top of 16. Next, also the text is centered in this component. And also this has a width of 600 pixels. But again, that's an inline style. So perhaps they're calculating something to make sure that the text looks really proper as a full width. And perhaps they're even using this library, which helps to ensure that the text always looks as balanced as possible. Because if you look on the left side, you see that's the normal way text flows. And the right side actually helps in making sure that it's as balanced as possible, no matter the size of your text. And that just makes things look a little bit nicer. So perhaps they're even using this to set that inline width. However, I'm not a really huge fan of this because this adds more JavaScript to your bundle and it doesn't really add a lot of functionality. And of course, it's really important to have things look really beautiful, but this adds quite some JavaScript. It adds a lot of event listeners. It adds repaints because there's things resizing, stuff like that. And if it's not necessary to do, I'm not a big proponent. So if we go back for now, I'm just gonna add a max width myself again. So that means that we're not gonna use any of these inline widths or additional libraries. We're for now just gonna add a width of 80%, for example, to kind of get close to their layout. And that also means that we need to center it. And that's already looks quite good as well, although it's perhaps not perfect. One thing they're also using is a different line height. It has a line height of 1.2. So let's for now take the leading height, which is 1.25 in Tailwind. That's again pretty close. The other thing is also our title that needs to have a margin bottom. And looking at the margin, you see that the H1 has a pretty small margin, but there is still room left underneath. And you can see they're even doing some negative margins in here, negative 36 pixels to pull this up again. But for now, we're not gonna use any of those negative margins until we really need them to replicate the design. So I'm actually, again, gonna use my screenshot tool to see what the distance is. So it's probably 48. If we look at the closest, or 44, that could also be the case. So if we look at our Tailwind config again, we can use the margin bottom of 11 for this. So let's go back to our title and add a margin bottom of 11. So that also gives some margin at the bottom of the title. And then it's probably time to add some color to this component as well. First thing we have to do is add the background to this image component. And it's actually not exactly the same as these gloss components up here. It's more white. So this means that we're gonna have to use a custom value here. And if we look at this image component, we see that there's 3 things in the background. The first thing is this border around the component. And they've used the before element for that. You can see the background here. And next to that, they also added a div in there that's empty, which I'm not a huge fan of. However, that also has 2 pseudo elements. The first one being the background of the component itself, and the second one being a noise filter. It's not very good visible, but again, it's a very small detail. So I kind of get why they had to add an empty div in here, because they need 3 elements. So there's not really a way around this. if you do not want to combine this filter with this background, for example. But that's also not really possible because this filter has, for example, its own opacity. So if we would combine this before and after, then that opacity would apply to both. And that's, of course, not what you want if you want to achieve this design. And the same thing for this border. This border is actually done via a background with a padding of 1. So it extends actually right beyond the size of its parent. And then they've added a mask. So it only applies to the outside, because this mask creates a mask that's actually exactly the size of the component itself. And then they use this mask composite to flip it actually around. So the mask becomes the inverse of itself. So that's the reason why this line is only applied on the outside. And if you remove that mask, you see that it would fill everything on the inside. So let's first start by creating this border by adding a before pseudo element on the wrapper of our image. So looking at the code, you see that they added a gradient as the background, which will later become only the line because of the mask. So we can add that by adding bg and then paste the gradient in there. However, what you need to do is replace all of the spaces with an underscore to make sure that it's a valid class name. If we add underscores in there and we go to our own rebuild, we see that this gradient is added. And looking at our class name here, you see all the underscores, and that then maps to a custom class name Tailwind generates for us. Next to that, we also need to take in the mask and the mask composite. And we can do that in a similar way. However, instead of adding bg in front of it, there is no way to create a mask in Tailwind itself. But with arbitrary values, you can create everything yourself. So what you can do is add a mask colon, which will be the left side, the styling property, and then you can paste in the value of it. And again, we need to replace all of the spaces with underscores. But via this way, we can create our own custom properties that are not existent in Tailwind at all, but we can still use them without having to go back and define them in our Tailwind config again. So the other thing we also need to take in is the mask composite, and that works in pretty much the same way. Mask composite, XOR, and of course, this should not be on our main image, but it should actually be on a pseudo element. And the reason for that is because this mask removes everything that's on the inside, because it inverses its mask and removes anything that's on the inside. And if we would put it on the wrapper div itself, it will remove everything of its children as well. So what we need to do is make sure that we add the before pseudo selector to all of our masks and backgrounds. So our content comes back again, but we also should add the padding of 1 pixel. So actually this pseudo element becomes 1 pixel bigger than its parent. So if we inverse that mask, you see a 1 pixel line. So that means before padding 1 pixel, but we should also make it absolute and extend to the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. So it's the full size. And we can do that with inset 0. But like always, if you create an absolutely positioned element, you also should make the parent relative. So this way it has something to be absolute to. And if we do that, we see that finally a line starts to appear. Only thing still missing is also a border radius. They actually were smart enough to use inherit for this, because that way you don't need to keep on specifying the border radius. It will go up to the nearest parent that has a border radius specified, and it will use that. So if we go up to the parent, we see that they use a border radius of 14 pixels. So we can use this 14 pixels as border radius as well. However, since this is not the default border radius in Tailwind, we have to use the arbitrary values for this again. So we can use rounded 14 pixels, but we then also need to use the border radius for our before pseudo element. And just like linear is the safest to use inherit for this, so we don't need to repeat ourselves. And as soon as we do that, we see that this border radius is applied. So the next thing is also adding this background. And I I think I'm not gonna implement this noise filter because that way I don't need to use an empty div. And yeah, I think that's what I decide to go for. So that means that we can use also the after selector on our wrapper and add in the background color that's used here. So that means that we can add after background and then add our color in there. But again, replacing all spaces with underscores. Or you could even decide to remove them. That would have the same result. Also, our after should be positioned absolute and also be inset 0. So it's again on the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. Yep. And as well, the after should also inherit the border radius. And if we do that and go back, we see that this background color is now applied. However, there is also some sort of fading happening, and that again is a mask that's applied. And that mask is applied to the div where they combine both the background as well as the noise. But since we now only have one element, I'm gonna add this mask on our after element. And if we then add that mask, we see that it fades out, which is beautiful. So the only thing that's still missing is the purple background, but I believe that's in the background of the full feature section. So that's something I will do in the end after I've finished the other two components. And also when all three of them are finished, I will also look at the responsive behavior and also tweak a bit in that. There is, however, still one thing missing from this component, and that's this divider line. So first for that, we need to make sure that we add margin on the bottom of our component as well. So let's change this to margin Y of 16. And then we can add in this HR divider line. So let's copy this gradient in and then add it in the component. They use the CSS variable to decide the direction of this line, but since there's nothing dynamic, I'm gonna add the direction right in here. And then we still need to prefix this with background and add the square brackets. And also add a margin bottom of 7.2 rem. And if we then look at the result, you see that I forgot to replace a space in the gradient class name. And you see what happens, and that is that this class name is not generated because Tailwind does not recognize the class name. So let's replace that space as well. And then we still need to remove the default border an HR has, because otherwise that's what you see. And we need to give our line a height of 1 pixel because we're filling the background and not a border. So if it doesn't have a height, you don't see anything. And that shows us the line. So that then brings us to the second component, and that is this feature grid. So we created this array of all of the features, and next what we have to do is render them out. So let's start by adding the features.map, which gives us one single feature. In there, we're gonna return a div that for now renders the feature.title, and as a key also gets the feature.title. Then next to the title, we also get our icon. However, since we're rendering a component, we should uppercase that icon name again. So let's destructure everything here into title, text, and icon, which we convert to uppercase icon. So that way we can render our icon, the title, as well as the text. That gives us this ugly looking list. First, let's see what the right font size is. That is 16 pixels, and that maps to our text medium. Then the color of this text is our primary text color, so that's text primary. Except for this title, which is text white. So let's add a span around there so we can give this a custom class name and make that text white. So next, let's make this a grid and have 3 columns. So everything flows nicely over 2 lines, as well as if we look at Linear's website, make sure that the items itself only have a max width of 256 pixels. And if we then make our wrapper full width, it will space them out evenly. And then the items on each row have a gap of 36 pixels. So in Tailwind, we can use gap Y of 9 to replicate that because 9 maps to 36 pixels and gap Y makes sure that we only add a gap on the Y axis. So now we have done this, we also need to align our SVGs because they're currently display block, which is the default, but they need to be in line, so they will be in line with the text. So we can add that style by selecting them with an arbitrary selector, using ampersand to select our current div, underscore as in a space, and then SVG. So that will select any SVG within this div, and then make it in line. Also, all of the icons are still gray. We should actually make them white. So let's also add fill white to that, and also see what type of margin needs to be added to this. That seems to be a margin right of 6 pixels and bottom of -2, so it's probably positioned a bit better. So let's do that. Margin right of 6 pixels and margin bottom -2 pixels. All right. And for now, it seems that the margin bottom isn't even needed in our case, probably because they use some sort of different positioning. And what I also notice is that our color is not applied yet. And that is because our color is not named primary, but it's named primary text. So text primary text is what it would be. Then also this title has probably a margin on the right side. No, they actually added a space in front of the other line, which perhaps is a better way to replicate this distance, because that way you have the real distance of a space and not something that's artificially created. So let's replicate that. Oh, and you see I tried to add an empty string, but Prettier now replaced it with a real space and just putting this on the exact same line, which is the same result. And I actually just now added a margin bottom of 2 instead of a -2 to our icon to align it just a little bit better. And again, once we add this purple background, the text will be better readable as well. So apart from the responsive part, this now also finishes this component, except a margin bottom again. And that's, in their case, a margin top on the cards component, but we're gonna add a margin bottom to our grid of 140 pixels. So that will be 14 rem. Great. And now on to the last component, the cards component. Again, this brings in an array of features, which we can render by features.map. Gives us the feature, and in there we can again render a div. And let's keep this the same as the previous one. So we destructure the title, the text, and the image, and then render the title, the text, as well as the image. And again, we can make this display grid with full width, and then a gap that we still need to take from here of 24 pixels, so that's a gap of 6, and that should of course be added to the wrapper and not the child element. But what should be added to the child element is the background gloss gradient, as well as a border and a border of transparent white. And we should also still add the columns grid called to. So all of the items are put next to each other, as well as check the proper border radius for all of these items, which is 48 pixels. That's rounded 4.8 rem, as well as have a padding of 56 pixels, which is our padding 14. And after we've added that, we should take the right font sizes, of course, which is 24 pixels for the main title. And that maps to our text to extra large, as well as the text should be white. And the main text is 16 pixels, which is our text medium. And the color is text primary text. And what you also see is that they set a max width on the text, so it doesn't flow fully to the right. And they did that by adding a max width of 310 pixels. So we can add that to our text as well, which will already give us this. There's probably a margin. Yeah, there's a margin missing from the main title that has a margin bottom of 2. And then the only thing missing still is proper positioning of the image as well as a gradient in the background. And looking at these images, you already see that this image is a lot bigger. I'm not sure if it's the right decision to add that image in this size, because if you're only using a small portion of it, it would be better to create a smaller image because that's a small file size as well. But just like linear, let's keep that image because I'm not going to open Figma and reduce this image file for now. So that means that we need to do some custom positioning for each image, like you also see linear do as well. So I'm going to add another prop to our features, which is image class name. That way we can pass in some extra classes that are set on the image as well. So this way we can uniquely position every image. And that probably is going to mean that the image will be position absolute. Yeah, you also see that on linear side. So that means that we have to make our parent position relative. And I also see there's a few default class names that are already passed in. And instead of repeating that class name absolute on both of the images, let's just use the class names package. So we can add absolute as a default and then add all of the other class names. We also probably need to set an overflow hidden to our wrapper because I see that they set the image to 200%, which of course would otherwise overflow. So then I'm going to go back to our cards, which are already complaining that they're missing the class name. So let's just for now take in the exact same values linear has and see where to go from there. Top of 40% and a width of 200%. And for the second image, that's a top of 34%, a left of 24 pixels, and a width of 110%. Let's see what that does. Okay. That could work if the cards had the correct size. So perhaps they have a fixed size as well. And they kind of give that a fixed size, but they're using the aspect ratio for this, which forces it to be just a little bit higher than when it would be a square, because they're using a 1.1/1. So we can use that as well by adding aspect and then use an arbitrary value again of the 1.1/1, which will size the divs correctly. The only thing we still need to do for the image is remove this max width of 100%, which is a default. So we can add max width of none as a default class. And with that, the image scales up and looks exactly the same as linear side. The only thing still missing from this card component now is the gradient in the background. And looking at their card component, you see that they add a radial gradient for this. However, that gradient uses a variable RGB. And this variable is exactly the reason why I waited with styling the background till the very last moment, because this variable is also used in the gradient here and in the background as well. So that's a variable that's set on the root level of the features component and then used within its children as well. So that's a really smart way to only set this once and then use it in different places in different components. So let's start with adding that gradient to the card and then also add the color to the wrapper of the feature. First, I'm going to copy this gradient in and add a new background where we will paste this gradient in. First, again, I'm going to replace all of the spaces. I'm going to leave in the RGB, although I'm going to rename it feature color. And the transparent is not a variable in our case, but will simply be transparent. We do have a small problem now, and that is that we have two gradients as a background. That could work, but will probably conflict in this case. So instead of having this background glass gradient, I'm actually gonna add a before where we're gonna add this gradient. But that also means that the wrapper needs to be relative because this before will become position absolute and also be inset 0. So this way it's exactly the size of the parent. Now I already had added the relative, so that's duplicate. But if we now go back, we see that the class gradient is still there, but the other gradient is not applied yet. And the reason for that is because we didn't set the feature color yet. So let's do that next by going to our feature wrapper component and set the color, which should be a string. And that color is then also accepted here. And then we're gonna add a new style tag in which we're gonna add this feature color, which is color. TypeScript does not recognize the definition of CSS variables though, so we need to typecast that to React.css properties. And now we still need to define this color. And if we take one brief extra look at the definition of this gradient, then you see that it's actually part of the RGBA function. So that means that the color that's put in here is actually comma separated color value like 255, 255, 255. So that is the value that our string should have. And it's actually pretty smart again of Linear to combine this string with the transparency that's always the same. But you need to know that the CSS variable needs to look like this. So that means that if we now go back to our component, it will be asking for a color, and that color is then a string that we need to take from a Linear. And that color, like you can see, comma separated color value is this value, which we're gonna add in. And if we do that and go back to our site, we see that this purple color is now applied. And the reason I am not using Tailwind to generate a class name here is because Tailwind cannot generate class names runtime. It needs to know upfront what all of the possibilities are. So if we want to do this with Tailwind, that's definitely possible, but then we would need to add a specific class name here instead of a color. So we could, for example, then say color class name equals minus minus feature color colon, and then add in the color. This could also work because this way, during build, Tailwind can see all of the different class names you're using, and it will generate this class name. But that would also mean that you need to copy this variable name everywhere where you use this section. And doing that could be prone to errors. So in this case, I prefer to render an inline style, so I know for sure that this keeps working. Although you can argue that this comma separated value is also pretty prone to breaking, but well, you need to take some risk in life, right? And now we've added that gradient in, there's a few things left. We need to make this responsive, which is the next thing we'll do. Then we're gonna add in the background color gradient as well. And after that, I see we need to fix some line height things here as well. And we need to add the animation as soon as the section comes in view. So first, let's start with making this responsive. So let's switch to mobile and see what we get. Looks like quite some work, but if we start with the changes with the biggest impact, you'll notice pretty quick that stuff already improves a lot. If we check Linear's website, we see, for example, that the grid goes to a 2-column instead of 3-column. So that's something we can pretty easily fix by going to our feature grid and making the calls tree from medium and up, and by default add grid calls 2. So that way, if we already go back, that already looks quite a bit better. And the same thing goes for the cards. They become a 1-column grid. So if we make the column 2 from medium and up, and then we can add a grid calls 1 on mobile. And then we go back and we also see that that already improves it a lot. Let's now quickly compare all the other things. We see that the text of the main image becomes full width. So the width of 80% is also something that only applies from medium and up. As well as the text size becomes a bit smaller. It's not a 4XL on mobile, but it's actually a 2XL. So let's change that as well. And the same goes for the grid text. It's a text medium, but that's only from medium and up. And on mobile, it's a text small. And you also see that the icon is on its own line on mobile. So that means that this inline positioning we did only applies from medium and up as well. And that probably also goes for the margin. And then for the span, that should also be on its own line if you look at the title. So that means that it's display block by default and display inline from medium and up. And that way everything also goes neatly on its own line. However, the margin bottom could still be applied, I see. And it's perhaps actually even a little bit more. It's 4. They put it on the title, but same result. So let's add the margin bottom of 2 again on medium and up. And by default, we'll make it 4. So that's already looking quite a bit better. Let's quickly check the cards as well. There is no responsive sizes going on for that. Although there is for the radius, that's rounded 2.4 rem. And from medium and up, it will be 48. And the same, yeah, there's also a different padding. So the padding 14 is also from medium and up. And then by default, we have a padding Y of 6 and a padding X of 8. And while resizing this, I noticed that some text is overflowing, and that is actually because we set a width. And that's actually because we set a width of 256 pixels instead of a max width. So let's also change that so that everything scales down as well. And this way, if we scale stuff up and down, it actually looks very good. So that's the responsive part. Now let's check how they created that background color for this section. Of course, there's a gradient up here as well, but it also feels like there's a background in the page or in the section. And after some looking around, there indeed is. There is an after pseudo element that wraps this full section. Like you can see, it ends at the end of the section, and that has a background gradient that uses the same color as well. So let's add that to our feature section as well. You can copy in this gradient, background. Then we need to replace the transparent again, as well as use a feature color here. And then we need to replace all of the spaces. And this should also be on an after element. And that after element is positioned absolute and inset 0, so it fills the full width of the element. And it means that this parent also needs to be relative. And that already gives us the glow, but the glow is now contained within the parent. And that is because we added a container to our page. So that means because of the way this component is styled, it's just not possible to add a container in the page. And we do have to add this container to our component. So I'm going to copy this into our component. And then I'm going to add it as a wrapper around the children, because this way the section itself will be the full width of the screen instead of only fitting to the container. And if we do that, we see that the glow is exactly the width of the screen. There are, however, 2 more gradients on this page. The first one is at the end of the title section, and that gradient extends pretty much the height of the full title plus main feature. And now I'm seeing this, I'm thinking if this title also belongs to the main image. Because if we're gonna combine this into one component, we also have one wrapper that we can use to fit the gradient within. Because if we would add the background to the feature's title, we would never be able to extend the background as far as the image will reach without the use of some JavaScript to calculate its height. So I'm actually gonna move this title inside of the main feature because I think it belongs there. They are kinda combined, the title, the image, as well as the text. So I'm gonna move this one in here. And that will mean that instead of children, we will get title. And then we also need to add title to our props, which will be a React node. And then also the structure title here. And then we can delete our title component and also add in the title as a prop to our main component. And I'm gonna render that as a fragment because there needs to be some sort of wrapper around it if we wanna use HTML, which breaks this into multiple children. So then the fragment is required. It looks a bit ugly, but for the gradient, this is very beneficial. So it's kind of a trade-off here where you want to sacrifice a little bit. Do you maybe want to divert from design, sacrifice a little bit in developer experience, what we are doing now? There's multiple options, but I think in this case, since design is so important, having both the break as well as a great gradient is way more important than having a little bit of an ugly prop here that still will work. So this still gives us the same design, but now we have this, we can go back to our main feature and add a wrapper around both the title as well as the image, which we can make position relative. And once we've done that, we can add the gradient to this wrapper div. So let's do that again by adding a before, which has a background that contains this gradient. But that also means that our before needs to be position absolute and inset 0. But that doesn't fully work yet. And the reason for that is because our wrapper div has a width of 78 rem. So it's actually centered. The width of this absolutely positioned element is restricted by that wrapper. So the only way we can fix that is by doing two things. This width needs to be gone, or actually it needs to be lower in the parent. So that means that this div should be gone, and then it should be added as a child to this wrapper. And next to it being a child of this wrapper, we also need to add a fragment so we can return multiple children. But next to it being a wrapper of these children, we now also need to make sure that we wrap the other children like they were wrapped inside this component before as well. So this way, our before pseudo element already extends a little bit further, but not far enough yet. And that is because it's still constrained by our container. So we need to refactor a little bit more. This component now will only be a div to give the Y margin. So that way everything is now full width. If we would add width full on here. So then everything is full width. And now we need to add this container to all of the elements that actually should be centered. For this main feature specifically, we can't add a container because then again, we would be centering everything in the middle. But we can add this container as a replacement for this 78 rem component. So if we do that, it will center itself in the middle again, but it will still respect all of those additional class names we put on it. So in this case, it's using the container, but it's a smaller container. And then for the other components, we can simply wrap them inside their own container. And now if we inspect this before element, we see that it extends the full width. And if we toggle this style now, we see that it is actually applied. And yes, we did all of this effort for only a very, very tiny gradient. But you have to agree with me, I think, that it's absolutely worth it simply looking at the visual style. It really makes the difference. Again, I think this is what makes my work so great. Refactoring things is simply just part of our process. We just need to keep on iterating on what we've built and improving. You cannot know everything up front. And also for me, while making these videos, it's impossible to look at everything up front and create a full picture in my mind. I just rather start on working and just keep an open mind on improving things while I'm going. So that means that we now have one gradient left, and that is the top gradient that you see here, and that becomes even more visible once the section becomes visible. And for that gradient, the linear team absolutely again showed some craftsmanship. It's just combining two different gradients, but the fact that they combined it and made it look like this, in my opinion, again, that's craftsmanship of Frontend. So somehow, if I inspect the background image or color properties, it doesn't show them. If I go to the computed tab and I check the background image, I kinda see something, but if I go to the style sheet, there's nothing available. So I guess my browser is a little bit confused about what's happening here, but what they are doing is combining both of these two variables. And these variables take in two colors. The first one being a top color, which is always the same, even though it's a variable, but it's for all sections, it's black. So I won't put it in a variable. And the second one is the bottom color. And this bottom color is a slight variation of the default feature color. But for sake of simplicity of this demo, I'm gonna take exactly the same color instead of defining a second color. If you wanna do that yourself while rebuilding this, you're absolutely welcome. Just do it. For this gradient, the linear team again added an empty div in the page, but I'm going to try to add a pseudo element directly to our section and see if we can get away with that as well. We are already using the after element for the gradient at the far bottom. So this time we're going to use a before pseudo element to add this first gradient. So let's add that gradient in. There will be a background, and in this case, it will be quite a long CSS class name, simply because there's even 2 gradients involved in here. You can decide to abstract this into your Tailwind config as well, but I also think that our Tailwind config was growing quite a lot with only 1 auth classes, that I, in this video, also wanted to demonstrate how you could decide to only put that inside your component, because that way it is contained where it's used and it's not bloating the config file with things that are rarely used throughout the app. So let's first add in the first color, where the top is a static value, which is 000212, and where for the bottom we're going to use the feature color, and then we also need to replace the spaces again. And after that we're going to paste the second gradient, where the top color is now the last color and the first color is still our feature color. And I also just now noticed that I left in the variable. That should of course also be gone. Let's verify that I also did that with the first one. And no, that should also be gone. And then we have to replace the spaces again with an underscore. And for a second, I also turned on the line wrapping so you can see how long this class name actually is, because this portion generates 1 class name for the both of the gradients as 1 background image. So if we go back to the app, you also see that our before element is rendered and that it indeed contains both of these gradients. We do, however, still need to add the before position absolute and before inset 0 to make it the proper size. Or actually, instead of the inset 0, this time they set a width of 100% and a fixed height of 400 pixels. So let's remove the inset and make that a width full and a height of 40 rem. And the gradient is also still not showing because we're putting the comma separated number for the color in here, whereas probably Linear was doing something different with, they are setting a hex color. So what we can do for this is wrap it inside RGB. So this way we have a full RGB color of the RGB numbers we put in place before. Okay, beautiful. I don't think this is right. And that's probably because they're also adding some really nice masks in there still. So let's have a look at the masks. And indeed, you see there is a mask image applied. And that mask image we can also add by adding before. And then we need to make an arbitrary value again. And also here we need to replace all of the spaces with underscores. And then I forgot a 1 space, which already brings us a little bit closer, but this is still looking far from perfect. So let's see what else they're still doing. And it seems there's actually a few things missing. They're still setting a background position as well as a background size. And they're also rotating the gradient by 180 degrees. So let's first add in these background properties. We start with the before and then add in the background size of 50%, 100%, and for the second one also 50%, 100%. Then we also add in the before background position, which is 1%, 0%, and 99%, 0%. And then we also add the rotate already. Perhaps the other ones we will also lead later on, but maybe only when the animation is active. So first we do a rotate of 180, and that rotate should of course be on the before. And if we do that, we already start seeing this aligned. So that's interesting. There's probably one more thing missing, and that's a background repeat. Yeah, it has a background repeat of no repeat. So that gives us before BG no repeat. And then we already start seeing the same layout they're using here. But you also see our color is way brighter than Linear's version, and that has to do with the color we are using. So unfortunately, I think we do have to add that second color because otherwise it will never look just as pretty as Linear's website. So let's add in the second color. We call that color dark. And for that color, we're going to use the exact same color, but Linear is using a hex color, but I would like to still use the RGB values, so at least it's consistent in the way you add the colors. So we can turn this hex color into an RGB color by shift clicking this square, and then we get the right RGB values. So that means that we can add the color dark, which is 53, 42, 79. And then we can add this color dark to the CSS properties as well. Color dark, and then color dark. And we of course need to destructure it. And now we can use that in our CSS variable instead of the lighter color. And doing that, that actually gives us something that looks pretty similar. The only thing they still do is play around a bit with opacity, because by default it has an opacity of 0.4. So that's 40. And then once it scrolls in view, both the title become visible as well as the gradient scales up and fades in. And I think that's the last thing we need to add for this component. So let's add in that scroll logic so we can make these animations work. So for this scroll logic to work, we can actually use the use in view hook we've used in our hero component as well, because that hook gives us a boolean if this component is in view, and based on that we can trigger a transition. So let's also add in that use in view hook, and that also means that we need to make this use client component now, because we're using Next.13's app directory and we are gonna add some interactivity now, which requires the use of use client. So we can also copy the definition of this hook, because that almost gives us the settings we need. The trigger once, in this case, we're going to set to false, because if you look at Linear's website and you scroll away and back, the animation keeps on triggering every time. So in this case, it should keep on triggering. First, we need to add the ref to our section, so the use in view has something to bind to. And then based on this boolean, we are going to do some animations. So for that, we're going to use a few things. First, we're going to add in the class names package again, and then we are going to use this in-view boolean to render a few classes. First, I'm going to add a isVisible class, because this isVisible class will help us to also animate the title later on, because this title is not part of this component. So otherwise we would need to style it in here as well, but I'd rather style it in the title component, because that case, if you would later, for example, delete the title component, you would also delete all other styles involved with that component. So first, let's style that gradient, because if it's not in view, it had an opacity of 0.4, and that's some code that we already added in here. That's this one. So we're going to copy that out and only add that once it's not in view. Then we're going to add the same code, but then as a full opacity. So this way, once this component becomes visible, the opacity should change. And it does not right now, because the threshold of 0.4 means that the full feature should be visible for at least 40% before it triggers. And in this case, it probably won't, because my screen is rather small and the section is really high. So if we change that to 0.2, and you see that the opacity changes. It doesn't have an animation yet, but that's something we can add in a second. We also first need to copy in the rotate. If it's not in view, it's rotated 180 degrees. But if it is in view, it's still rotated, but we're going to add a few more transforms. So we're going to use an arbitrary value so we can combine them in one property. First one is rotate 180 degrees. Then we have a scale of 2, And finally, there's also a translate Y of -200 pixels. Oh, and these commas should actually be underscores because in CSS they are spaces. So if we do that, we see that the component becomes too large already. So that means that we're gonna add the overflow of hidden, and perhaps only on the x-axis because we're moving the component upwards. You only see that it's still rendering in the center of the component. And after some playing around with it, I saw that I just blindly accepted this translate Y as well, but it's actually not necessary with the way we set up our code. So if we remove that, we see that it scales up, it fades in, and it just becomes more visible. The only thing still missing is adding that nice transition. So let's also copy that in. So that's also on the before, and then a transition of transform with also a duration that's, I'll make it 1000 in this case. That's almost 960, right? And we also need to set the easing, which is before ease linear. And if we then go back, we already see that the scaling works, but we should also transition the opacity, of course. So that means that this transition transform is going to become an arbitrary value and then be transform, opacity. And this way, it animates both of them. And I think it should not be linear, but ease in. So this way it nicely eases. Then the final thing is also making sure that we transition the title so it moves up. And this title in Linear's case has a transform of none when it's hidden and -40% when it's visible. Doing that makes it kind of hard to position the text, I can imagine, because you're transitioning into a space it actually doesn't belong. So I want to reverse this. By default, if it's visible, it has no transform. And when it's hidden, it has a transform of 40%. In my opinion, that feels a bit more logical. So let's go to our title, and that lives in this main feature. And in here, we can use the isVisible class that we set right here to decide whether to show or hide this title. So we can do that by adding .isVisible _ampersand. So this then targets our current h2 by looking for a parent higher up that has a class isVisible. And if that's the case, we can, for example, add background red to just test this. So if that is the case, you already see that the background becomes red. So that means that we can now set the transform translate Y to 0. But by default, if it's not visible, it has a translate Y of 40%. Now we also need to copy in the right animation, which in this case is a rather custom transition. So I'm going to copy this fully and just paste it in here as transform. And then we're going to paste this in. I'm going to make this 1000 milliseconds, so it's at least consistent with the other one. And we need to replace all of the spaces again. So this way we have a custom transition. And if we now test this, it's still not working. And that is because it's, of course, transition, transform, and not transform. And if you do that, we now also see that the text fades up. Beautiful. One thing that's still annoying me, of course, is this cutoff text. Oh, and now I try to inspect this. Another thing is also that these elements now became clickable, so they lie on top of the text. So let's also add a few before pointer events none. Also to the after pointer events none. The same thing we do to this wrapper. And also to this last element where we also had a before. So this way we can select text again. And then we can finally fix this annoying cutoff text. And that I'm gonna do by making the line height slightly bigger, because the reason it's cut off is because we're using a mask that clips the text to show this gradient effect. So I'm going to go into the extra large variants and make the line heights just slightly bigger. So this way, at least the text is not cut off anymore. One other thing that I noticed right now is that the grid is aligned to the left, whereas if you look at the linear side, you see that it's actually in the center. And we can fix that pretty easily by adding place items center to our wrapper container, and that will neatly align them in the center. And that again looks so much better. And you know what's even better than one super nice block? Having 3 of them. So I took a little bit of time just now to also add the content of the other 2 blocks and have a look together with me, because looking at it with all the different colors and gradients, it looks so incredibly nice. You also see how great it works to set these color variables and then having these blocks also accept that gradient. I mean, that's so great. I also did one change off camera, and that is adding an image size to our main feature, because the other 2 images were larger than the first one. So I added the option to either have a large or a small image, which will render a different width on the image wrapper. But that's the only thing I did. Next to that, I created 2 new sections where I added the new features in, and I just added them in the homepage. I did not change the icons because that would be too much work to replace all of them, and it wouldn't really add any value for now. But yeah, these sections look super nice. There is one small thing with the gradient that's still overflowing. I will also fix that off camera and commit that soon. So that will also be soon up on the test environment where you can view that. But this video, at least source material, is already 4 hours long. So this is already quite a lot of work to edit. So this will be the end of the current video. There's a few other tweaks I also want to do. For example, adding an alt tag to this image. Having alt tags is super important for accessibility. So that's also something I would definitely still want to do if I had more time. We also did not get around to using next image as well instead of normal images. So we can use more responsive images, lazy loading, things like that. I will also probably soon add that off camera so you can view that in the source code as well, but that won't be part of any video. Looking at Linear's website, there's 2 sections left, one more of these feature components, but I want to do that on camera, especially because of this animation. So that will be part of the next video, as well as this final piece on the page. That will also be part of the next video. And after that next video, there will be one more video where I'm gonna roast my own code, because there's been little times that I really stood still to reflect on the code I wrote. And there's probably here and there quite some places where I would like to improve upon myself. So I'm gonna do some sort of code review on my own code and try to improve from there to really improve the product even further. So absolutely subscribe to this channel so you get a notification once the other 2 videos are up. Also, please leave a like on this video because that helps the channel a lot. Commenting is also really valuable. And also, like usually, check the links in the description where you find links to both the source as well as a preview URL of what we've built so far, plus a link to my Discord, which you also have to check out. It's a paid Discord server, but that also means that you have direct access to me to pick my brain and hopefully learn a lot very quickly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you in the next one.